Well, welcome back. Today I'm going to talk about pooping, specifically constipation. And before you tune out thinking, I go to the bathroom most days, this doesn't apply to me, I want you to stick with me because a lot of people don't even realize that they're constipated. They think I've always been this way, or maybe that's just how my body works, or I only go every few days, but that's normal for me. Constipation is one of those things that gets brushed off, or you may not even have talked about it, not thinking that it could be an issue. So today I want to talk about what bowel movements should actually look like, what your stool can tell you, and why constipation matters way beyond digestion. And also some of the root causes that often get missed because constipation is common, but it's definitely not normal. And it's often a clue that something upstream needs a little bit of attention. So one of the things that I'm always surprised by is how many people are constipated and don't even realize it. Not because they're ignoring symptoms, but because it's been their normal for so long. Maybe they go every 2 to 3 days. Maybe they have always needed to strain to have a bowel movement. Maybe they sit on the toilet for 20 minutes. Or maybe they never quite feel like they're done. And over time, they start to think that's just how my body works. But adaptation and normal aren't the same thing. Your body can adapt to a lot of things. That doesn't mean that it's functioning optimally. Generally speaking, I want to see at least one bowel movement a day. And it's not just about frequency. I mean, it should be easy to pass. It should not be painful. You should not be sitting there scrolling on your phone forever. And you definitely should not feel like you're not completely emptying afterwards. So, because even if you go every day, if you're doing any of those things, straining, feeling uncomfortable, or not fully emptying, I still would consider that to be constipation. So your stool can actually give you a lot of information. It's one of the easiest windows into digestion, and most people have never been taught what a healthy bowel movement actually looks like. As a matter of fact, most people don't even look. Think about it. If you have pets, like dogs, for example. You take them for walks every day and you pay attention to their poop. If they're going, how much, how often, what it looks like, and you'll know if something's up, if there is a change in the habits, and you'll investigate. Yet most humans won't afford the same thoroughness to themselves. So first, frequency. Generally, I want to see at least one bowel movement a day. I already said that. And sometimes more, depending on how much food and fiber you take in. So if you're eating a lot more food and fiber, then naturally you'll have more waste to eliminate. Next, let's look at that Bristol stool chart. You can Google it if you've never seen it, if you need one for yourself to have handy, but generally we're looking for something that's formed, easy to pass, and not hard pellets, but also not loose or urgent. So the type 3 and type 4 is basically considered normal. Anything outside of those ranges would be something that you'd want to take a look at. And then color matters. It needs to be, or it should be, medium to dark brown. That's generally what we expect. Bile is actually what gives stool the brown color. So when it's pale or clay-colored stool, that's often a clue that there is an issue with bile production or bile flow, which links back to the gallbladder. Sometimes you can have green stool, and that just means that food is moving through too quickly. Now, if you have red stool, then it could be you ate some beets or something else that's red in color, or it could also be concerned that there's some bleeding going on. And then, of course, black stools, lots of folks are familiar with that. A lot of times that comes from supplements, for example, like iron supplements, they can make your stool black. But also, if you had some bleeding in your stomach from like an ulcer, once the blood red blood cells are digested, they turn black, so that could also turn the stool black. So if you have black stool and you're not taking any supplements, then certainly something to investigate further. And then, of course, then there's smell. Sure, stool isn't supposed to smell amazing, even though they make potpourri that you can put in your bathroom, but extremely foul odors can sometimes point towards poor digestion or some other kind of imbalance. And then one people rarely talk about is how easy is it to wipe? If stool sticks to the bowl, or if you're wiping forever to clean yourself up, it's likely that you're not digesting protein properly. That's what makes stool really sticky. And then, of course, floating stools tells us there is an issue with fat digestion, which points back to the gallbladder. So if you have pale stool and it floats, then definitely investigate how well your gallbladder is functioning. The point is that these things aren't like random tidbits of information. They can clue you in into some distinct patterns related to how well your body is functioning. Because bowel movements aren't just about getting rid of food, they're also one of the main ways your body eliminates other waste products. For example, we can look at estrogen as one of the hormones. Your liver processes estrogen and packages it for elimination. In that it gets hooked into the bile, which then gets released when you eat a meal. And so it moves through the digestive tract. And ideally, it'll leave your body with your stool. But when you're constipated and stool sits in the colon for a prolonged period of time, there's lots of opportunity for these estrogens that have already been spent to be reabsorbed, which can lead to estrogen dominance. And that can matter, especially for women still cycling, but also women in peri or postmenopause that are dealing with things like bloating or breast tenderness or mood changes or stubborn weight or many other hormone related symptoms. Of course, there's bile. I already mentioned it briefly. Bile helps break down fats, but it also acts like a transport system for waste products. We already mentioned hormones, but also cholesterol. So if there's excess cholesterol, it gets hooked, attached to the bile and moved out of the body that way. And also toxins and other waste products from your metabolism or things that you take in, like medications, for example. So all the things that the body wants to eliminate. So changes in bile flow often show up in the stool too. I already mentioned the pale or clay colored or floating stool. So strongly, if you have these issues, I strongly suggest that is to look at the gallbladder function and how or why it's not able to keep up. Now, last week I talked a little bit about the microbiome. Your gut naturally contains trillions of bacteria, and that's healthy. We want that. But when certain strains of bacteria die, they release compounds called endotoxins. And one of them is LPS. So when the stool sits longer, those inflammatory compounds like LPS or lipopolysaccharide, they remain in contact with the gut lining longer than is good for it. And that prolonged contact can lead to inflammation and then also breakdown of the gut barrier, which then, of course, can lead to leaky gut, which I also talked about a couple of weeks ago. So you can see how all this is connected and how you can end up with symptoms like fatigue or brain fog or skin issues or joint discomfort, symptoms that are seemingly unrelated to digestion. So constipation isn't just that you haven't gone to the bathroom. It really means that the body isn't taking out the trash efficiently. And then over time, that can affect much more than just digestion. Now, knowing all this, it's important to understand that constipation is not the root cause. Constipation is a symptom of a deeper underlying dysfunction. And as you can already tell by the list on the screen, there are different reasons why a person may become constipated. And that list is not exhaustive. Those are just the big ones. So for some people, motility is just simply slow. And that can happen with things like thyroid issues, chronic stress, low stomach acid, and even nervous system dysregulation. And then for others, the issue could be more mechanical, some pelvic floor dysfunction. The urge is there, but the muscles aren't relaxing and contracting appropriately, so it's not moving the stool through like it should. And then there's methane, and this one gets missed all the time. Some gut bacteria produce methane, and if there's an overgrowth of those bacteria, it leads to increased methane production, which then further can slow down the transit of the stool through the colon. And that doesn't mean that you need to kill those bugs, but rather investigate what allowed them to overgrow in the first place. And then, of course, there's stress and thyroid. You've heard me talk about the nervous system time and again. Nervous system dysregulation is just so pervasive. We're constantly running and going and always stressed out. And it's not just the mental, emotional stress, there's also physical stresses, and all of us deal with it at some point or another. The gut is not separate from the rest of the body. And when you're stressed, it will be affected by it. And the stress response shuts down anything to do with digestion. So it will also slow motility. And then last on the list is medications. NSAIDs and narcotics, of course, are the big culprits. And most folks don't know that NSAIDs like ibuprofen or aspirin or Aleve, they can also lead to constipation. But there are many other medications that folks take on the regular that can have that effect. So just read your labels and be aware what you're taking and what kind of side effects to expect. The important thing here is that constipation isn't caused by just one single thing, which means there usually isn't one single solution. Now, one of the solutions that's often offered or advised is is fiber. And this is a common complaint I get from people. They say my doctor or my provider or the internet or my friends, they told me to drink more water and eat more fiber. And that can actually lead to a lot of frustration. Now, some people, that strategy will help, but not everyone. And because constipation isn't always caused by low fiber, it's also worth mentioning that fiber isn't just one thing. There are different types of fiber, and some fibers will add bulk, and some will feed beneficial bacteria, and some are fermented more aggressively. So some are gentler, and so even saying that increase your fiber isn't actually a very specific advice. However, in some cases, particularly when there's the methane producing bacteria, if they're involved, then adding more fiber can actually make symptoms worse just because it sits longer in the gut and then it has more time to ferment and the bacteria have more time to feed on that fiber and create more methane and slow things down even further. And that's really what I hear most often is like, I've tried everything, I've increased my fiber, I drink more water, and nothing really seems to help, or even worse, I feel more bloated than I did before. And that's because that generic advice assumes everyone has the same root cause, and they don't. It's like telling every constipated person to eat more fiber. It's almost like telling somebody that's very tired to sleep more. It's just not very effective. So we'd probably want to understand why this constipation is happening in the first place before we start throwing solutions at it. Because the solution really depends on what the mechanism is. And as we already discovered, constipation can come from very, very different mechanisms. Now, I want to talk about laxatives because that's a common advice in conventional medicine is take a laxative. Your doctor tells you, the TV talks about Miralax, your social media feed or your family or your friends say, I'll take you, just take some Miralax. And sometimes you need to. I am not anti-laxative. I use them in certain situations, but I don't want them to become a lifelong strategy because you eventually your body will come to depend on that outside assistance. And over time, the effect will weaken and you'll need more and more, or it'll just stop working completely. And now you need something different, or maybe you need to start taking multiple remedies just to achieve that same result of having a bowel movement. So I want to talk a little bit about how they work. First, there's the stimulant laxatives. And these stimulant laxatives, they stimulate the nerves in the gut wall. So they actually trigger the contraction that you can see on the screen there on this diagram. And so they force the gut to move. And that's why they often work pretty quickly. And they're the ones with where long-term use can really lead to dependence and reliance. And that doesn't mean that they never have a place. I already said I'm not anti-laxative, but I use them short term in some situations. But I'm cautious, I'm just really cautious of the years of reliance on that. And then the other kind is the osmotic laxatives, things like magnesium, lactulose, polyethylene glycol, or also called Miralax or Movicol. And so those are osmotic laxatives. Vitamin C can also function in that effect when it's taken in higher amounts. But they work differently. They draw water into the bowel and that helps soften the stool so it makes it easier to pass. Generally, they're thought to be a little gentler because they're not forcing those contractions, but they're not without risks either. Actually, drugs.com, which is a great website if you're on medications or supplements and you want to research them, drugs.com is a great place to go. It actually states in there, do not use polyethylene glycol more than once per day, and call your doctor if you're still constipated or irregular after using it for 7 days in a row. And I know people that have been taking it for years, not just 7 days. And it's what happens often. You call your doctor and what are you going to say? I've seen so many people, even kids, who've just been taking it forever. And it's just really sad to me because there are solutions for this. And then lastly, I didn't list it on the screen here, but there are stool softeners, things like docusate sodium. Those don't really stimulate motility. What they do is they help water and fats penetrate into the stool so that it's softer and easier to pass. It's a different mechanism. But all of this matters because a lot of people think that laxative is a laxative, and that's just not really true. They say some of them force contractions, some of them pull water in, and some just soften the stool. So understanding how something works really matters so you can apply the right remedy to the right problem. And if you've needed help going to the bathroom for years, the question really ought to become why? Is it the methane, or is it the slow transit, or am I just chronically stressed? Do I have pelvic floor dysfunction? There's therapists out there that will address that. Looking at the thyroid, looking at digestion, and if none of those check out, then look for something else. But as I already said, constipation really is a symptom, not a root cause. So if you don't investigate that, then the management really becomes that long-term strategy. And I just don't think that years of constipation should automatically be accepted as normal. The goal here isn't lifelong dependence. It really should be restoring that function. So by now you can probably see constipation isn't always solved with one thing, but there are some simple strategies that really can help. First, of course, is toilet posture. You've heard of the squatty potty. If you haven't, I highly encourage you to watch that video. It's really cute with the rainbow colored unicorn pooping ice cream. But it's really can be very effective strategy to get in the proper position to defecate. Our bodies were designed more for a squatting position. We didn't have toilets until about, I think, 150 years ago when they first came into fashion. And so in the squatting position, your butt is lower to the ground. It's not level horizontal with the knees. And so this squatty potty, if you put it in front of your toilet, can really help relax that pelvic floor and help you eliminate easier. And for some people, that alone could be enough to solve some problems. Then, of course, there's a routine. Your gut likes rhythm, your body likes rhythm. Some people find that a morning routine can help. Maybe drinking a glass of warm water with some salt in there, going for a walk, consistent wake times and natural light to set that circadian rhythm. All those things help support the gastrocolic reflex, which is basically the signal that tells the body we're getting ready to start it for the day. There's going to be food coming in. Let's get things moving. Then magnesium can help. Depending on the form, it may draw water into the bowel and support easier elimination. Magnesium citrate is the one that's commonly sold over the counter. Magnesium glycinate is also a good option, but you got to, be aware that more is not always better. The goal isn't to have urgent loose stools. The goal is to have normal formed stool that's easy to pass. Then we got meal spacing. You've heard me talk about the migrating motor complex before, so that's your gut's housekeeping phase between meals. If you're constantly grazing, you don't have that 3 to 4 hour window between meals. That cleaning cycle doesn't activate as effectively, and things tend to stay around longer and can cause that dysbiosis where the less desirable bacteria are allowed to overgrow and then create this methane situation or the LPS situation. And of course, then we have movement that matters as well. Going for a walk, gentle activity. Our bodies were designed to move. We're not meant to sit in chairs all day. And so that's can be really beneficial to get things moving on the inside when you move on the outside. Now, none of them necessarily will fix root causes by themselves, but they can definitely help support motility while we're figuring out why things slow down in the first place. So when we step back and we look at everything that we've covered so far, you can hopefully see that constipation isn't usually a random symptom. And it's not usually that you just need to eat more fiber or you need another supplement. It's really just a clue around motility, digestion, bile flow and utilization, the stress response, thyroid function, microbes, pelvic floor function, hormones. And often it's not just one of them. Typically it's two or three in combination that are leading to that constipation symptom. And that's really one of the reasons why I get really frustrated with labels like IBS, because IBS tells me that something isn't working well, but it doesn't really explain why. And the why matters more than anything else because the solution for methane related constipation isn't the same as the solution would be for low stomach acid, for example, or your pelvic floor dysfunction. So there's different causes that require different solutions. That's why some people spend years trying to figure things out and feel like nothing has ever worked when, in reality, they may have been solving the wrong problem all along. So constipation, it's really common, but I just don't think it's normal. And long term doesn't really mean that it's got to stay like this forever. The body will adapt to symptoms, and it doesn't mean that those symptoms should be ignored. So when you think about the complexity of constipation, of course, you can see where lab testing may come in handy and help facilitate that personalization to get a really personalized plan focused on whatever the root cause is. So we can use a GI map, for example, to look at the microbiome and also figure out how well are you digesting protein? How well is your gallbladder function? Or is there steatocrit in your stool, which is an indication that you're not digesting your fats? We can use the Dutch test to tell us hormone levels, especially cortisol, the stress hormone, as well as the sex steroid hormones. We can look at mineral status and mineral balance within HTMA. So there's a lot of option depending on what the underlying symptomatology is. So something to consider. So hopefully now you can kind of see how constipation isn't always as simple as just drink more water, eat more fiber, take a laxative. The biggest thing I want you to take away is this. Constipation is common, but common doesn't automatically mean normal. And just because you've dealt with something for years doesn't mean it has to stay that way. I already said that the body will adapt. It'll adapt in both directions. When you do nothing, it'll make do with what it has available right now to function. If you provide the environment and the resources for healing, it can and will heal. It's in its own best interest. So my question for you today is, how long have you assumed your constipation was normal? Or did you even realize that you had it? Now, lastly, I have this little guide for you. If you're curious about the state of your motility, you can use this at-home motility test, and you can find it at the QR code. And with that, I will see you next time.